Good morning or good afternoon, and welcome to our webinar, ERM Implementation, a primer to a five-step process. And today's webinar is expanding into insights to integrating strategic planning. My name is Jeff Frigsby. I'm President and CEO of CB Resource, and I'll be conducting today's session. First, I do want to thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us on this webinar this morning. We indicated it's going to run about 45 minutes, and I certainly intend to stick to that. I am approaching this slightly differently than I have in previous webinars, in the sense I want this to be more of a discussion about how ERM and strategic planning are interrelated, and how by understanding or raising an organization's awareness to how they can leverage each other's components, you end up with a better process all the way around. And so we'll begin into that shortly. So before we do get started, just a quick word. So for those of you who have any comments or questions as we go through the process, feel free to use the instant messaging capabilities built into GoToWebinar. Just post it and we'll respond in a timely fashion. Also, there'll be a Q&A at the end of the session. If you would like to have copies of my materials from today's session, by all means, just let us know. You can do that via the GoToWebinar communication mechanism. You can shoot us an email, or you can certainly call us directly, and we'll get the presentation right out to you. So let's just take a quick overview and purpose of today's session. So from a deliverable standpoint, or the process, we will talk briefly about what is ERM, why enterprise risk management. We'll take a look at both enterprise risk management from a process perspective, as well as strategic planning, and look at both those models. And then we'll embark on walking through each of the implementation steps of an effective ERM system. But what I'd like to do is call out or I articulate how that particular element is integrated and supports your strategic plan and the strategic planning process. And then we'll have some closing thoughts and questions. But as I mentioned, my goal or the purpose for this session is really to walk you through and define each of those steps. We are still talking about how to implement an effective ERM process, and that's the core component of our time today. But I really am looking forward to highlighting within each of those steps how you can leverage your ERM process to deliver a targeted strategic plan, and understand that there's an optimal relationship between the two if you integrate them in a certain method. So let's go ahead and get started. ERM, according to COSO, and COSO is certainly the founding organization that defined the construct of enterprise risk management, and that kind of goes back to 2004. But most recently, COSO did step back out and update what they define as an effective ERM program, if you will. And they define enterprise risk management, kind of an interesting sentence, but I'll read it as written. Enterprise risk management includes the culture, capabilities, practices integrated with strategy setting and performance that organizations rely on to manage risk in creating, preserving, and realizing value. So I think what's interesting, it's the integration of resources, but even in their brief definition, it is all about strategy. And to me, that also implies that an effective ERM system that ties back to strategy is probably more of a top-down, and we'll be talking about a top-down approach to enterprise risk management. There are two, right? You can do a top-down approach, which tends to have a strategic element. It integrates optimal performance of the bank as a driver of the process. A bottoms-up approach tends to be more granular in nature, certainly can involve a broader sense of the enterprise, and it certainly gets into testing and ensuring policies, practices, and processes are being implemented, and controls for that matter, in an effective manner. So we'll be looking at this discussion and this five-step process, looking at it from a top-down perspective. Now, when we think about if ERM is about, kind of going back to it, if ERM is about the ability to manage risk and creating, preserving, and realizing value, well, strategy, or your strategic plan, and I'll go to my third bullet, is really designed to how a bank is going to drive to optimal and sustainable value. But a good strategic plan should, is a clearly defined course of action that defines how you're different or better, right? That's the purpose of a strategic plan. It should focus on achieving more than your fair share in good times and bad. So regardless of market conditions, your strategic plan is that kind of guiding light that says, this is our course of action to achieve, optimal and sustainable value as we choose to define it. My only other personal comment on a strategic plan, because we do it, I see a lot of them, less is more in terms of goals and objectives, and it really should focus on how you are driving to be different and better. So those are kind of the definitions. Why are banks engaging in ERM? Pretty straightforward. It does support your ability to achieve strategic objectives. It certainly can enhance and improve the quality of decisions being made as it relates to both risk management and performance management. Once deployed and implemented, it should significantly elevate the level of risk awareness across the enterprise. If it's working, it should be forward-looking and support your ability to reduce operational surprises or loss. Again, if it's working, it should prepare you well to pursue and act upon acceptable opportunities as they arise. It does work as a mechanism to support your business continuity and business integration within your organization. And in the end, it really should support the ability to optimally leverage your capital and break down or bridge the silos across the organization, be it by risk category or organizational department. And when all said and done, at least from our perspective, when we're talking about top-down enterprise risk management, we do believe it's all about the maximizing of earnings, capital, and franchise value. So those, and so when we look at the process, and now we're let's start down our journey of bringing the two together. We're going to talk about a 5-step process today. And we'll do this for the balance of our time, and we'll integrate the discussion of strategy as it relates to ERM. But if you think about the process, the top-down process in step 1 is really about governance, right? It's about looking at your strategic intent, and it's about developing your risk appetite up front. And we'll get into risk appetite in a second, but by evaluating your strategic intent and your risk appetite on the top end of your ERM process, it helps you more effectively calibrate the remaining 4 elements of an effective ERM program. And those steps are pretty clear. And by the way, if you're doing any due diligence or evaluating enterprise risk management solutions for your bank today, be comfortable that whomever is providing you the pitch, that they articulate specifically how their solution will help you identify risk, measure risk, monitor risk, and control risk. And if it's a worthwhile process, and this, I don't care if it's software, if it's professional services, or a hybrid of both, it should be a continuous improvement process that continues to get better over time. So step 1, determine what your risk appetite is. Step 2, identifying risk, and we'll get into that. That is your enterprise risk assessment platform. Measuring risk is that additional question of saying, when we look at our risk, what is the likelihood of it occurring? If it were to occur, what would the impact be? Once fully assessed as far as it relates to controls, is there residual risk? If there's residual risk, what are my controls or what does my risk mitigation plan look like to address them? And then, from a monitoring standpoint, who gets what and when, and how is it distributed? And on a controlling basis, is that distribution of what's being monitored support your ability to make better decisions and control that risk, be it policy related, process related, or business practice related. Okay, and if it's working well, it's a continuous loop and improves over time. So let's go ahead and in strategic planning. I'll just we're talking about what ERM looks like as a process. A good strategic planning process really gathers data first, right? And that's what ERM is all about. ERM is, if you really think about it, it's this huge database of information, right? And it's environmental information. And so if you think about it, is there environmental or macro intelligence in an ERM system? There should be. Is there micro, meaning kind of your organizational level stuff or the closer market analysis? Is that in your ERM system? It should be. Right? Your own performance, internal analysis, other feedback. So if you think about strategic planning on a process, you capture your data, you organize it, right, in a way that's useful to interpret. You go into what I would characterize as constructive conflict and debate as far as forming your strategic course of action, if you will, or strategic formulation. That really helps you define your mission, your vision, what assumptions, what your key priorities are, what you intend to do over what period of time and how you're going to measure it. And then it should align with budget. Go into execution mode. And like ERM, everything, if you view it as a process versus an event, it's always about a continuous loop of ongoing process improvement and streamlining and effectiveness. Okay? And if you think about where they intersect, so if we are putting together, trying to ask this question, how do we leverage our ERM platform to support our strategic and even capital planning? Think about the key chunks of what they need to address. So does an ERM address earnings, capital, and franchise value? Well, it should. And so does a strategic plan. Obviously, that's primary. Does it address risk appetite? Well, in an ERM scenario, it defines it. It quantifies it. In strategy, it's more likely implicit than explicit, but it's in there because your desired growth and targets for earnings and the risk you're willing to take is your risk appetite. You just may not be defining it as such. Do both require external analysis to understand the competitive landscape and the economic conditions? They absolutely do. Internal analysis, what we're doing, how we're doing it, that has to be assessed and integrated. Do they both understand what the organization's assumptions to do business are in? And do they need to understand the bank's priorities? Absolutely. Are there measurements and metrics? Yes. Goals and objective milestones integrated throughout. Tracking and reporting? Absolutely. So if you break it down into what I would call modules, each of these systems, each of these internal processes of your bank need to either support, produce, or respond to this intelligence, and then use it for better decision making and execution, whether you're executing ERM controls or risk controls or managing performance. They are connected. Okay. And then if you just think about it as it relates to your strategic plan as an output, a strategic plan for execution purposes, the non-negotiables, it should have your key assumptions and priorities. It should set the table for where you're going and how, what your forecast is, how you measure it, and your goals and objectives. And in the lower part of the plan, what are the specific goals and objectives in the action plan, right? So those are the strategic planning components that make a strategic plan focused on performance. What helps make better decisions is all the stuff in the middle. And this is what you pull from ERM. So if you think about your strategic plan is asking a series of questions that have to do with how your bank is going to perform and how you're going to choose to do or not do something to create value, your ERM system is most likely the best source of data to make better decisions. Okay? So let's go ahead and let's just spend the balance of our time going through the 5 steps of implementation, talk about what that looks like from an ERM standpoint, and then how that plays into strategic planning. So step 1 in our case, top-down ERM process, is governance, right? And as I mentioned before, that first step in a top-down environment is developing your risk appetite and linking it into your strategic plan and into actually your governance around ERM, right? So what are the kind of the first primary components of your first step or your risk appetite, if you will? Is we encourage that everybody involves their board, but if you think about it, your board is the control point. So there should be board involvement in developing your risk appetite and establishing your governance structure. We tend to look at establishing risk appetite by risk category. You can have an overall risk appetite statement for your bank, but your risk appetite can be different based on different areas of risk, right? And it should define those. So in this example, we've got credit risk, interest rate risk, liquidity risk, operational compliance, strategic, reputation, cyber. You can look at it by you could be looking at trust, insurance, mortgage. If you have a platform or a payment system, it could be payment systems. But we tend to look at risk appetite from where the risk resides, right? And what are we willing to do in that area? And if you think about risk appetite, it's really just answering the question, what are we willing to do or not do in order to create value or make money? Right? So the three takeaways, on the risk appetite side would be your risk appetite heat map, risk appetite statements, and then key risk indicators. And these are nothing more than quantitative measures that illustrate tolerance levels, right? So if you're looking at credit risk, interest rate risk, any of these risk categories, you should be able to articulate what low to high looks like. And that determines where you are in that tolerance band as it relates to your risk appetite. And when you think of risk appetite, think of it in terms of basic assumptions, right? Risk appetite has a lot to do with growth. It has a lot to do with customer selection. It has a lot to do with delivery channels. It has a lot to do with the role of technology. It has a lot to do with markets that you do business in. So when you think of growth, when you think of the customers you serve, when you think of technology, your delivery channels, the more you do of any of those things, it usually indicates you're taking on more risk and should be articulated in your risk appetite. Right? So if you think of step one, it's about risk appetite, and it's also about adopting your ERM policies as it relates to your charter. And in policy, charter and policy could be and should be either at board level and or bank management level, typically both, right? So in ERM, that's what that first step is: risk appetite, policies, procedures, process. But how does that come back, and how does you integrate your risk appetite and strategy? Well, if you think about it, risk appetite really defines what your control system should look like from an ERM standpoint. So if you're taking more risk in liquidity or more risk in operational risk, you should calibrate your ERM system accordingly. So from an ERM standpoint, it calibrates your ERM system itself. From a strategic planning standpoint, it does answer the question of what you're willing to do or not do to make money. Right? Think about it. So if you have literally a low tolerance for risk and interest rate risk, and you're not going to leverage certain higher risk vehicles to enhance yields or reduce costs, well, that's strategic. If you're willing to take on more liquidity risk, meaning you might want to run your loan to deposit ratio to 90, 95, or 100, that's reflected in your strategy. Right? So there is this connection between your risk controls, which is ERM, and your performance intent, which is strategy. So again, when you think about tying in your risk appetite and your strategic planning process, think about your growth, think about what you're trying to do with earnings, think about customer types, product types, how you're going to fund the business, the role of technology, the regulatory considerations, for those of us that are in legal marijuana states, you might be evaluating strategically to support this liquidity need or this funding need that ultimately you want to bank cannabis companies or marijuana-related businesses. Well, that should be in your risk appetite, and your operational risk appetite might go from low, moderate out here to high because you're now dealing with MSBs on steroids, right? So there's a direct relationship, though, between ERM control systems and helping set the table for strategy to ensure we have the right controls in place to achieve the performance our strategic plan calls for. Okay? So as you kind of go through the process, so the first step in governance, setting the governance up, looking at what you're willing to do and not do to make money, the next step of an effective ERM system is how you identify risk, or what we would characterize more as your enterprise risk assessment process or platform, if you will. And we always recommend that you dial into a framework first. And so frameworks could be regulatory driven, but just to use some examples of a framework, you can use CAMELS. If that's the lens you want to view risk through and it makes sense to you and your board, then use CAMELS. If you're an OCC bank, OCC has very clearly defined risk categories, right? Credit risk, interest rate risk, price risk, liquidity risk, reputation risk, operations risk, compliance risk, strategic risk, and that would be their framework. If you're a Fed member bank, FRB's got like 5 categories, right? Credit, market risk, liquidity risk, operational risk, legal, and reputation, or adopt a hybrid. But the first step before you start launching your enterprise risk management system, like developing a database, create your hierarchy, right? What's that look like? And then you can dive deeper down. So here's an example of compliance risk, right? So compliance risk may be your risk assessment category for your assessment, but you may want to look at other entity level risk, compliance and management systems, BSA, AML, OFAC, fair lending, consumer lending, deposits, abusive and deceptive practices, privacy. You could have regulatory reg compliance, but again, setting up your framework for the assessment is kind of key. Once you've established your framework, then you want to select what you're going to assess within each of those categories. And if you guys would like to get this sample dashboard, this is nothing more than an inventory list to conduct an effective risk assessment by risk category. So when you look at credit risk, interest rate risk, liquidity risk, price risk, operational risk, compliance, we do have a useful user's guide, if you will, to identify what needs to be tested within your enterprise risk assessment. Can you do that on an Excel spreadsheet? Short answer is yes. Can you buy a technology platform to do that? Short answer is yes. Can you find a hybrid between the two? The short answer is yes. But what you want your assessment to do is clearly articulate the level of inherent risk. In OCC, you might call it the quantity of risk. So quantity of risk or inherent risk should be clearly defined. Your adequacy of risk management or your quality of risk management, but from an OCC standpoint, needs to be defined. And then there's a couple of ways to go. You can go with residual risk, or you can go with composite risk or aggregate risk. Regulators tend to use composite and aggregate interchangeably. Others will use residual risk, but that's that third data point, right? You're applying your inherent risk to your control systems and seeing what risk is left over, right? Or how you've moderated your risk or modified your risk. And then the last indicator is direction of risk. So if you think about your enterprise risk assessment system, it's really giving you an overall profile of risk across the enterprise by key risk categories. That is its intent. That is how these things are designed. So if you think about the enterprise risk assessment process being the second step of your program or of your process, think about what it does for strategy. Rather than getting into a little workshop and saying, what are our strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, your ERM system could be the genesis or the source data to answer most of these questions. So when you think about it and you're looking at, and so first of all, let's define, SWOT, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, a standard strategic planning exercise, right? So strengths are what you do well. And I will tell you, they're more than what you do well. Your strengths should be those capabilities that can be leveraged. And if you have a capability that can be leveraged, that leads to scale. That leads to growth, right? So does an enterprise risk assessment tell you what your strengths are? It kind of does. If you look at adequacy of risk management by risk category, it's pretty much going to help you determine and quantify, not just, so instead of just saying our people are our strength, what is it about your people? Is it about your control systems? Is it about your internal processes? Is it about how you integrate technology? Those things come out of a risk assessment from an organization. Also from a weaknesses standpoint, right? Can we identify weaknesses through an enterprise risk assessment system? Well, guys, that's what it does. That's what it's designed to do, to assess how you are doing in the areas of processes, policies, practices, and controls, right? So if you want to determine what your weaknesses are from a strategic planning standpoint, so guys, those of you who are giving ERM to a different part of the organization, bring them back in, because that ERM dashboard should be able to be laser focused around what needs to be fixed, both in terms of operationally and overall strategically, because weaknesses are nothing more than impediments to getting you from where you want to go, right? They're an obstacle and they need to be mitigated. They need to be fixed. So opportunities, a little more, probably not quite as tangible in an ERM standpoint, but I'll tell you what, if you're looking forward, if your ERM system is asking where the markets are going, where the economy going, what are the influences on your business as you look forward, it should be able to articulate both opportunities and threats. So, again, SWOT analysis tends to be somewhat organic in a strategic planning process. ERM brings a science to it. Okay. And so just going through the process, step 3 in an effective ERM system, it's that measurement piece. Now, in our world, we think, the measurement piece is an additional step of the enterprise risk assessment process. And that is, what are my top risks? So if I've looked at all my risks, some risks are greater than others. Your measurement process needs to identify which risks are greater than others. And if a risk seems to appear greater than another one, then go through an exercise that says, if this is my top risk, it could be cyber risk, it could be accelerated growth, it could be expanding a new channel, it could be a core conversion, it could be those are top risk if not implemented well. In acquisition, identify what that risk is, and then ask the rhetorical question or the measurable question, what's the likelihood of this risk occurring? If I don't do this well, what's the likelihood that this can happen? If it were to happen, how severe would it be? Where does the risk reside? In what part of the organization? Can I identify it from an inherent risk standpoint? Can I measure my controls? And ultimately, is there any residual risk or risk left over? If there is, what am I going to do about it? And that's in this measurement exercise, this top risk analysis. What is the risk? What's the residual risk? What are my actions? And can I take those mitigating actions and migrate them into a risk mitigation plan? And that is what the third step of an effective ERM system does. It should take all the risk and determine which risks are higher impact than others. Okay? So when you link that to strategy, again, this is probably expanding a little bit more on what I was saying about SWOT, but ERM, it provides the analysis and the forward-looking views of either where your opportunities or risks reside, right? And that could be identifying a top risk or an issue or an obstacle. From a strategic standpoint, it does answer questions regarding your competitive landscape and your operating conditions, right? That's what this analysis does. And things that you want to go into this interpretation are market conditions. Do you want to grow 5% in a market that's flat or getting smaller? That represents a higher or lower risk, but it also represents a strategic challenge. So what are the market conditions? What's the competitive landscape look like? What's the economic outlook? What's the regulatory climate? And what do the capital markets look like? If you need capital, is it affordable? Is it expensive? That all occurs in this process. And you can see the relationship directly between an effective ERM system of measuring these things and a strategic planning process, putting them to work. So externally, that's what the external piece does. Internally, pretty straightforward, and we've already discussed it, right? When you look at what your inherent risk is, what your adequacy of risk controls, your composite or residual risk, and direction of risk, gives you that internal information that answers the question, whether you're looking through a SWOT lens or just saying, if I want to grow at an above average rate and make an above average level of income, creating above average value for my shareholders, don't my capabilities need to be quantified? Don't I need to know what's leveraged? So if your ERM system is producing that output, is my capital adequate? Is my adequacy of management strong? Then how far can I leverage it? How far can this dog hunt? So there's a direct relationship of using an internal controls measurement system to determining how far you can leverage that in the pursuit of your strategic goals. So that, again, a direct link. And if you think about it, right, it all flows into what I would call more of a strategic planning output, right? Because if you've gone through this analysis and you've tied your enterprise risk data to a strategic planning process, it should flow to assumptions. And assumptions are nothing more than a description of the landscape you're competing in as you look forward, right? So it articulates the operating environment. And if you understand what the operating environment is, you can calibrate or determine what your near-term and long-term priorities are. Now, when I talk about near-term and long-term priorities, if I've done all this good assessment of my ARM system, I've looked forward, I've looked at my capabilities, I've made my strategic decisions of where I want to go, they should convert into priorities. Do I want to grow at a certain rate? Do I want to be in the top quartile in earnings? Do I want to be in the top quartile of return on equity or operating efficiency or non-interest income or asset quality? but it's going to kind of determine what my non-negotiables are, which are going to be the foundation for really the next step of a strategic plan, which would be its goals. But if you think about it, the key considerations here from a standpoint of ERM is take ERM for a strategic plan and look at how it could morph into performance targets, how it could be sensitive to where the risk resides to make sure that risk is adequately controlled and doesn't impede your ability to pursue what your strategic plan is all about, which gets right down to book value and market value equity, earnings per share, and multiples of earnings, things of that nature. Okay. So step 4, dashboard, right, is selecting the right measurements to keep an eye on where your risk resides and how well it's being controlled and is it moving, right? And so when you're setting up your monitoring system, you want to look at how frequent is that report going to be generated, what's it going to consist of, and who is it going to go to? And in addition to looking at your key measures around key risk categories, it should also be a system that could identify potentially emerging risk or threats. And it should be something that can be transformed or translated into an effective board communication vehicle as well. This is not an easy thing to put together. For those of you that have an ERM system, one of the toughest challenges is aggregating the information into useful vehicles for decision making. And I'm going to skip over. And so when you think about that, that's what your control system does, is what does the board need to see, what does management need to see, and what does the committee need to see. So you really do have to structure your data appropriately. But once you've got that data in place and you've created those dashboards, think about how easily that could move and migrate into a tracking and reporting system for strategic performance indicators. You've already got the KPIs and the KRIs in your ERM system. How about just tweaking them to integrate it into a performance scorecard that supports your strategic planning process, or tracks and reports your capital adequacy, and basically ties in to your ERM control system. So those key factors that both from an ERM standpoint and from a strategic performance standpoint, again, growth, earnings, what's your spread look like? Are you managing concentrations? How's the capital holding up? Looking at yields and cost. These factors that we look at from an ERM standpoint are at the source of managing strategic performance. So there's a direct relationship between the two. And it does come down to that fifth and final step, right, of who sees what and when, and how does it form better decisions. So if we're talking strictly about ERM, it's really about understanding where the risk resides, understanding where it's trending, and does our system adequately measure our control systems, and does it have some sort of forward-looking mechanism to determine what risks are going to look like tomorrow as well as where risk looks like today. So in terms of that fifth step in an effective ERM system, it is about creating dashboards or reporting mechanisms that speak to the decision-making tree, right? Whether it's board, management, or committee. That's what ERM does. In a strategic plan, it's pretty much goals and objectives, right? So if you can take that ERM dashboard and look at it as it relates to your strategic planning, my guess is there may be things in your risk mitigation plan that will ultimately support, but it should be totally integrated with what your strategic plan is calling for. So your strategic plan will capture and prioritize your goals and the actions necessary to achieve your mission and vision and your optimal performance levels. And your ERM system will monitor the risk and trends that ensure you're controlling the risk so you can achieve your strategic intent. I think this is where you get efficient. So I mentioned, as far as key considerations, don't overlap goals, objectives, and key actions. They should be integrated and synchronized. So think about ERM as a risk management system and strategic planning as a performance management system. That's what they are. The more they're synchronized, the more you can align your risk management priorities with your business performance priorities, which is strategy, the more they should be more efficient and more homogeneous and more integrated. So maybe easier said than done, but if you think about the quality of that, there's almost a synthesis that occurs. So if you think of ERM in an audit form, it's a data system, right? ERM has your risk appetite. It has your risk assessment. It has your top risk and your risk mitigation plan. Your strategic plan kind of takes stuff from that says, well, if these are our conditions, if this is where my risk resides, this is what the market's like, this is the course I'm going to take to optimize my bank's performance. And that's going to find its way into strategic goals, objectives, and key actions. And I haven't really talked a lot about capital planning, but it's kind of the third leg of the stool. You always want to make sure that your capital plan is aligned with your strategic plan and supports your risk profile. But in the end, they are seamlessly integrated if managed properly. So I guess my closing thoughts is when you look at these things like enterprise risk management, strategic and capital planning, it's really about synchronizing your risk priorities with your performance priorities. So if you happen to be a chief risk officer in your bank, and perhaps it's more of a bottoms-up approach, or you're looking at bottoms-up approach, and there's a challenge with connecting what's going on in ERM and the strategic performance side, seek to integrate some top-down perspective, because that's the nexus point. It's a bottoms-up is very challenging to communicate at the transaction level of the bank, which has to do with your policies, procedures, and controls. And how's that communicated to a strategic perspective? Well, that is a challenge, and that's where even a lot of our ERM clients that come from a bottoms-up perspective kind of have a breakdown. But if you think about it, create a dashboard from an ERM standpoint that is forward-looking and articulates the strengths of how the bank works is where the risk may reside. That has immense strategic planning importance. So for those CROs that are managing kind of a bottoms-up approach, you actually need to be at that strategic planning table with your data. Better decisions will be made. So anyway, if you think about it, this use of information should be synchronizing performance priorities with risk management priorities. Secondly, if you do this, think about how efficient this can be, right? If you use ERM as a centralized database system, if you will, that really captures and reports both risk and performance-based data, how efficient is that? And if you think about it over time, doesn't it even make some optimal result in terms of efficiencies and perhaps even savings? And in the end, if you're integrating these two disciplines as opposed to working them from functional silo perspective, integrated, they do move you more towards maximizing your earnings, capital, and franchise value. So I know I may have phrased this more as a discussion as opposed to a webinar just giving a how-to book, but it's just something I feel very strongly about in the industry. And I think the more that the risk management side of the house and the audit side of the house and the control side of the house connects with the performance interests of the bank and vice versa, both are going to be better. And both will serve what we think all banks are driving for, and that's optimal performance, right? So achieving the highest level of performance while taking the least amount of risk seems to be an ideal target for any community bank. So with that, I hope you found this information useful. And just, before we get to Q&A, just to, strangely enough, isn't it funny, what CB Resource does is what we've been talking about, right? So we do integrate enterprise risk management, strategic and capital planning, and we just feel they are seamlessly, inherently associated, and they need to be managed together, and they don't belong in functional silos. They belong in interactive organizations that bring those resources to bear in an integrated fashion. And we do that through ERM, and we have various programs to do that, and we hope you'll contact us to learn more about what we do. So with that, I think we've left a little bit of time if you need to run off, or if there are any questions, by all means, feel free to use the instant messaging system to post it. Okay. Interesting. So I do have a question that does ask, is there a technology platform today that brings those all together Great question. I don't know of one. I know we attempt to in a hybrid fashion, but there's so much qualitative analysis that goes into strategic planning, and I believe that is also true in enterprise risk management. So as far as a single automated solution, I am not aware of. Okay. Well, great. I hope this was useful for many of you. It's actually kind of neat. We've had a combination of our existing clients that just wanted to kind of hear our thoughts about that, and a lot of you folks that are new to CB Resource. Just a closing comment about CB Resource. We are based in Irvine, California. We do have community bank clients in 33 states in the country and pushing up around 200 banks we currently serve in the areas of enterprise risk management, strategic planning, and capital planning. We hope you'll take this opportunity to learn more about how we can help you synchronize and prioritize your performance and risk management areas of focus. And with that, thank you all for taking time to share with us in today's session. Oh, and by the way, if you do want this presentation, by all means, shoot us an email, give us a call, and we'll get that right off to you. Thank you very much.